Okay, I think we will get started with today's presentation. I'm sure more people will be joining us, but I'd like to leave as much time as possible for our speakers. My name is Maura Cunningham, and I'm the Digital Media Manager at the Association for Asian Studies. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's AAS Digital Dialogue, which I'm hosting from the AAS home base in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where we acknowledge that the land the city of Ann Arbor occupies is the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, including Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi, and Wyandot peoples. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone in the audience to our book launch tonight for Reform and Nation Building, Essays on Socio-Political Transformation in Malaysia. This is a new publication from the AAS Asia Short Series, and it's written by Munira Alatas, who is a scholar and commentator in Malaysia. It's a series of essays, volume commenting on recent Malaysian politics and society. So I think we're going to have a lively discussion with Munira and our four commentators. We have James Chin, who is Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania, Meredith Weiss, who is at the University of Albany, SUNY, and she's Professor of Political Science, as well as the director of the SUNY-CUNY Southeast Asia Consortium, and Teren Sevea, who's Professor of Islamic Studies at Harvard Divinity School. We're going to begin with a presentation by Munira talking about the book and introducing its major themes, and then each of our commentators will offer a few comments, ideas for discussion, questions, etc. If anyone in the audience has questions, you are welcome to submit them using the Q&A box on your screen at any time, and then we'll address them toward the end of the program. So with that, I think we're going to get started. And Munira, would you like to begin?
Thank you for the introduction, Maura. Good morning to those who are just waking up in Malaysia and elsewhere in the region, and good evening to all of you in other parts of the globe. First of all, I'd like to thank a few people, David Kenley, for one, of Asia Shorts, John Wilson of the Association for Asian Studies, and Columbia University Press, of course. Thank you for seeing me through this whole process. I'd also like to thank the commentators, discussants James, Meredith, and Teren, for agreeing to do this, to spend your time, your free time in the evening, as well as the reviewers of the manuscript. I really appreciate all your comments, and I've attempted to incorporate most of them into the final manuscript. So thank you very much. Now, I'd like to take about maybe 20 minutes or so to just give a brief overview of the book, which actually I enjoyed writing, although it was at times very frustrating because of the kind of politics we were going through over the last few years. The purpose, let me give you a brief reason or purpose in writing the book. There are a combination of factors, but mainly the first one being GE14, the 14th general election, was on the horizon. And 1MDB, the scandal, 1MDB was unraveling at the time. So there was a lot of anti-corruption sentiment in society. And I would say this was around it started me thinking seriously about conditions at home around 2016, 17, and of course 2018 when GE14 happened and took place, and we were very happy and elated with the results. One other factor was my retirement from the public university system. That was I was considering if you can say, my career in a public university system, and I was very disappointed with my experience. So that was another push factor for me to write about what I was feeling for the last 20 years. I guess I felt an overwhelming need to communicate with general readers, not just the scholarly community, but general readership, from a combined perspective of a scholar activist, which I am, an intellectual, as well as a fellow Malaysian citizen. So I wanted to combine these three approaches, if you will, and reach a general readership, not just the scholarly community. And so I needed to do this in simple language, but with purposeful conceptualization as part of my long-term vision to educate the general public. I know that sounds very ambitious, but nevertheless, it was in the back of my mind. That was what was going on in my mind. Issues which triggered my observations or perspectives was corruption and its impact on education. I wanted to offer readers a different perspective, and specifically a perspective on the purpose of the university. So if you're not familiar with the book, the larger portion of it is devoted to higher education, the second part of the book. So my main message actually throughout both parts is that regime change will have little impact unless leaders make a political and moral effort to link structural reform and national cohesiveness to the fundamental and bigger task of transforming the entire education system. So for me, I needed to reconcile the problems that we were having politically with the larger, bigger picture, which was not really specifically addressed, which is our education system. The narrative very typically sidelined the problem of education. I realized quickly also after GE14, talk of reform quickly became discourses in a vacuum. Leaders leaders and the public, they seemed fixated on short-term transformations for the nation. And as 2018 progressed, it was very clear that leadership was less focused on holistic reform. And of course, the public became very impatient because immediate change was not apparent. Now, for me, talk of reform was very disappointing after GE14 because the agenda to revamp education quickly fell into the background. It became a small part of the reform agenda. And now that brings me to my next point, which is what was my analytical framework for the entire process of my thinking while writing the book. And I would say, basically, it was incorporating the ideas of my father, Syed Hussein Alatas, and I will proceed to explain what I mean by this. When PH 1.0, because we're now in PH 2.0, after coming to power in 2018, I started reflecting on the general trend of elite politics. And then the issue of leadership sincerity and the lack of ethics became very clear that it was a problem. I saw a distinct pattern in leadership behavior, which had persisted over decades, 60 years of politics. The old guard continued in Malaysia Baru. It was a repeat of the same dynamics. It was very obvious. Lack of integrity, lack of sincerity, and a lack of shame among leaders. And this was manifested in continuing talk and actions that was obviously corrupt. Cronyism was happening again, patronage as well. So I reverted to the thoughts and the ideas of my father, who had been writing about all these issues since the 1950s. So I thought it was appropriate for a scholar, a Malaysian scholar who has been writing and at the same time being sidelined, marginalized, and even ignored over the last several decades. I thought I wanted to resurrect the very problems which still exist that he spoke and talked and wrote about. And basically, this was about UMNO politics. And now we come to talk about it as UMNO DNA. All right, so let me now elaborate on what I mean. It's basically, the book is basically an attempt to present a holistic and long-term view of our socio-political complications and difficulties. It focuses largely on the problematic leadership ethos, which has deeply penetrated the education system. And this is the essence of how leadership is destroying the country. And specifically, I tap on my father, Syed Hussein Alatas's ideas about corruption, spirituality, leadership, and education. So these themes have greatly influenced the analytical structure of the book. Now on corruption, which now we refer to it as undue influence. You know, the word corruption and undue influence, cable, access to cables. These are all used interchangeably in popular writing now. But the root, the root of the nation's problems are basically a combination of the lack of leadership, integrity, and the shrinking of an intellectual spirit in intelligentsia, and the preference for short-term band-aid populist fixes, which are all driven by the 5-year election cycle. So there's very little energy or desire for long-term perspectives on our problems and strategies to fix it. It's all about quick fixes. And Alatas, my father, had always written and spoken about this phenomenon, so about political leadership, which must incorporate the values of integrity, morality, and perseverance. So the word perseverance is linked to this issue of the need to have a long-term vision. And I must add that these are not incompatible with Islamic values. So, and yet these are purposely put aside, or I would say ignored and neglected in our politics. And then I'd like to say something about the community of intellectuals, which I mention a lot in the book, and how the will to think and the need for intellectuals in our societies, are they are consistent themes throughout the book, especially in part 2. I emphasize the role of the intellectual or the public intellectual as well, and the scholar activist within the context of reforming our public universities. You know, recently Anwar Ibrahim, our current Prime Minister, he had referred to the need for open discourse in universities at his opening speech at the last week at the Global Intellectual Discourse 2024 launch at University Malaya. But however, you know, one cannot conceptualize open discourse if we continue to ban critical scholars from speaking openly. We continue to disallow discussing controversial topics. And if we continue to use draconian laws in the university system, such as the Universities and University Colleges Act and Act 605. So, I mean, we recently had the case of Professor Ahmed Kuru, who couldn't speak due to some pressures from diplomatic pressures. Nevertheless, open discourse is merely a pipe dream so far, although I applaud Anwar for mentioning it. Let's see if it materializes. The other aspect of my politics and morality, however, I do now in retrospect, I should have mentioned explicitly, but I didn't. I don't mention in the introduction or throughout the book, the Rukun Negara, which is very pertinent for the themes that I brought up in the book. I don't mention it specifically, but I also want to mention it here now, that the commentary part of the Rukun Negara, which many Malaysians don't know exists, forms part of the analytical framework throughout the book. It was in the back of my mind throughout writing, you know, throughout the few years that I was putting this book together. For those who are unfamiliar with Rukun Negara, it's Malaysia's national philosophy, and it embodies the fundamental values that define Malaysia as a nation. So I mentioned commentary. Now, many Malaysians don't understand or are not aware that the Rukun Negara is actually a huge document. It is about 20,000 words, whereas Malaysians are familiar with 5 principles, which is half a page long. The significance of the commentary, which forms the bulk of the Rukun Negara document, it helped shape my articulations on diversity, acceptance of difference, nation-building aspirations, morality, and the common goals of all ethnicities in molding or in creating a Bangsa Malaysia. All these values were incorporated in the commentary of the Rukun Negara, which goes back to 1970. So knowing the commentary will provide a direction on how to reform our country. For example, we will realize how to maybe either repeal AUKU and Act 605, or eventually disband it, because the Rukun Negara explains why it is okay to do so. I mean, it sounds like we need to be told how to provide space for intellectual discourse. But that is the state of the situation in Malaysia. We really need to be told. The commentary basically clarifies in detail important parts of our federal constitution as well. Because a lot of the problems we are facing is because of misunderstandings surrounding parts of the constitution, which remain confusing, they're unclear. And let me give you an example of some of the confusing concepts. I think James, one of the discussants later, you'll be familiar with the words progressive, liberal, freedom, undivided loyalty, respect for the Constitution, high standard of morality. All of these concepts are in federal constitution. But terms like liberal are hotly debated and rejected among large segments of the conservatives in Malaysia. And this is because we are not familiar with the commentary of the Rukun Negara explaining what these mean and why they are necessary in the constitution. So that's part of my that is part of what formed the background of which helped me put the book together. I think I'm just going to say something about the second part of the book, which is my thoughts, strong opinions about the higher education crisis. It feeds back into part one on the need for a community of intellectuals in the country. And of course, this refers, the ideas are taken from, are applied from my father's book, Intellectuals in Developing Societies. Because there is a need for a close interaction between intellectuals and the ruling elite, which to date is not happening. Universities are supposed to facilitate this in a sense of providing checks and balances, to encourage the culture of asking what-if questions, probing questions, and to exert pressures on bad policy, or to suggest sound alternatives. And again, these alternatives have to have a long-term vision. And I feel the responsibility of the universities is this, but it's not happening. I also highlight very strongly in the second part of the book, my perception of what the obstacles are to knowledge production. I think we can discuss this later on, but it goes back to draconian laws such as the AUKU, Act 605, political interference in the administration of the universities, academic dishonesty, which is rampant and it's increasing. And of course, I've written about this a lot, our obsession with the global university ranking system. So all these are obstacles to knowledge production in the country. So let me actually conclude. The book is actually my hope at further awakening the political consciousness of the ordinary Malaysian. And it's also an attempt at to intellectually awaken academics in the country. And in the conclusion of the book, maybe there might be a second edition, I'm not sure, but I hope I need to write something more about the Rukun Negara and this part, which I'm just going to mention now. I allude in the conclusion, Malaysian politics being mainly about Malay factions outdoing each other. There is a fight for control over the top job, to be in Putrajaya. The war, unfortunately, the war against corruption, although always imperative to fight against corruption, is targeted at this group, these factions, settling old scores. And the long-term vision to unite ethnicities does not seem to be a priority. So I need to unpack these ideas more in the context of the general theme of the book, and I hope I do have the time to do it as soon as possible. And part of it is also I want to incorporate a longer discourse or discussion about the Rukun Negara and its relevance. So I think I'm going to end here, and I thank all of you for listening, and I welcome any input after this. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Munira, for outlining the book and your thinking behind it and all of the importance. At this point, I'm going to invite our commentators to offer their points for discussion, and we're going to go in the order of James, Meredith, and Teren. And each of you can just unmute yourself, offer your comments, and then we will regroup for a general discussion after you're each finished. So James, would you like to begin?
Thank you very much, and a good evening or good afternoon, wherever you are. I'd like to start off by thanking the organizers for the kind invitation for me to take part in this book launch. I'm very pleased that my friend and colleague Munira has written this book. I will just take up a few minutes because I would like to devote more time for discussion. I think I'll start off by saying that the title of the book, Reform and Nation Building, Essays on Socio-Political Transformation Malaysia, actually captures what the book is all about. The focus is on the problems with nation building in Malaysia, especially after the first regime change in 2018. The book itself is essentially divided into two parts. Part one, as Munira said just now, deals mainly with leadership and politics. Part two deals with education and governance. All the chapters are written in a simple, straightforward manner, like what you will find in what we call an op-ed in many current affairs magazines. But having said that, I think you do need a basic knowledge of Malaysia, especially issues related to racial politics, Malay special rights, Islam and royalty, to understand what the author is trying to convey or saying. Some of the readers of this book, especially Malaysian readers, will find some of the chapters familiar because it has been published elsewhere in portals like Free Malaysia Today and Malaysia Kini. Now, after reading this book, you sort of get the feeling that nation building process in Malaysia has actually yet to begin. Anyway, that's how I feel. In part one in particular, some of the key issues raised by Munira is exactly the same issues faced by newly independent Malaya in 1957 and Malaysia in 1963. Here I'm talking about the issue of Malaysian identity, and that remains unresolved. Race and religion remains the key drivers of all facets of Malaysia life for the past 67 years. In fact, I would argue, and I think the authors has hinted this in the various articles, that race and religious identity politics is even stronger today than it was half a century ago. There doesn't appear to be any movements when it comes to Malay political development. I think the author has made it very clear that the core feature of Malay political development are feudal and patronage politics. And she makes a very important point. These are exactly the key drivers of Malay politics before Merdeka or before independence as well. So in other words, I think she's trying to make the argument that nothing has changed in terms of Malay political development. She also refers extensively to her father's writing, and I quite like how she tried to link some of the articles to her father's seminal book, Intellectuals in Developing Societies. And what is very clear to me is that many of the things happening in Malaysia now is exactly the same, again, like what the father wrote in 1977. Here, I would like to give a story that was told to me by a very close friend of mine who works in a university in Malaysia. In fact, the same university that Munira was associated with. So this person was an associate professor, Professor Mak Yeo, who openly supported the then opposition Pakatan Harapan. So when Pakatan Harapan won in 2018, he began to throw his weight around immediately. Sure enough, he was promoted to a full professor shortly after that. But this was not enough. Given that his cable were now controlling Putrajaya, he wanted to go higher. And shortly after that, he was awarded a datukship. I was told by his colleagues that from that day onwards, he will only reply to you or acknowledge you in the corridor if you refer to him as Professor Datuk. Otherwise, he will just walk past. I suspect Munira will agree with me that this is an example of feudal mindset in Malaysian academia. Or maybe she can add on to chapter 22 called Scholars are Charlatans, the infamous Professor Kangkong. Anyway, for me, the core of the book is really part 2. Part 2 essentially deals with the issue of higher education in Malaysia and the development of knowledge among the Malaysian intellectual class. I think when you read the different chapters, it is very clear that Munira writes as an insider, as someone who spent decades in the system and thus was a first-hand witness to many of the issues that she's writing about. So given the time constraints, I would just like to list some of the key issues raised by Munira when it comes to higher education in Malaysia. The first, and the one that she mentioned a few minutes ago, is of course chasing the rankings. In the Malaysian system, this means that all Malaysian universities want to be in the top 200. In fact, that is one of the KPIs for the 5 research universities in Malaysia. They have to be in the top 200 or they'll be punished financially by Putrajaya. It really doesn't matter that most of us, at least working in this industry, know that this is actually part of a commercial game and many of these can be game. But it doesn't matter. In Malaysia, they take it very seriously. And this is reflected that every year, all the major newspapers in Malaysia will publish the rankings of Malaysian university when it comes out. The second key issue that she raised, which I think is very important, is meritocracy in the hiring and retention of staff. Unfortunately, in the Malaysian system, the reward goes to people who can produce more than 30 papers in dubious journals. And I think in recent times, we've seen many examples of such people. I think she also makes a very good suggestion that we should go for quality rather than quantity. And this requires a fundamental rethink about the way the expansion of university system works in Malaysia. What is not widely known outside Malaysia is that when they decided to expand the university system in Malaysia, the guiding force was not quality. The guiding force was that every state must have one university. So even before they talk about, academic staff, whether they have the human resources at university, the thinking was that every state must have one university so that none of them will complain. And after all, Malaysia is a federal system. I think another important point that she makes, which I really like, is that in the Malaysian system, we should really value the humanities. Because in the Malaysian system, right, all the interest, especially in terms of interest put on by the Vice Chancellor, is all in the STEM area. Humanities really has no champions in the Malaysian university system. And of course, one of the big problems we have in Malaysia is that there's really a lack of ethics and integrity among senior academics, which again, Munira mentioned just now. The last big problem with Malaysian university, which she mentioned, is that many of the universities in Malaysia, both private and the public universities, they don't really believe in educating. They believe in providing a certificate that will allow their graduates to get a job. In other words, chasing the job market is more important than getting a real education. Reading part 2, I cannot help but think that many of the problems that Munira writes about can also be applied to other developing countries. And in fact, when it comes to chasing the rankings, you can also apply it to first world universities as well. I suspect many of her thoughts and views during the first few years of regime change reflect the views of what people call the Bangsa crowd. They feel that Malaysia has lost an opportunity to undertake real reforms, and they feel politically nothing has changed. In fact, many of them feel that things have gotten worse in Malaysia. But many would argue that the Bangsa crowd is actually disconnected from the rural Malay ground, who are the real power holders of the Malaysian system. But that is material for another book. Munira's book is important in my view because her views represents what Malaysia could have become post-2018. But unfortunately, there are very few people with the ability to think like Munira in Malaysia. So how should we situate Malaysia's present reality as painted by Munira? Well, one can argue that it takes time to transition to a more democratic future. After all, it took Indonesia nearly 2 decades after 1998 to what it is today. The experience of Eastern European countries after 1990 is also instructive. It took them a very, very long time to cement democratic institutions. The second view is perhaps less charitable, and that is the view that Western-style democratic institutions never really took root in Southeast Asia, despite 200 plus years of colonial rule. So you can't expect countries like Malaysia to become more democratic over the long run. And in fact, you can make the argument that you can see traditional powers coming back in a big way. For example, the election of Bourbon Marcos last year, the king of Thailand tried to get back royal prerogatives, and of course in Cambodia, where the son has taken over from the father. So you really can't expect Malaysia to be any different. My view is that the Malay political elite have a very clear view of what the Malay state should look like. This is especially true after the 1969 riots. This was the infamous Ketuanan Melayu philosophy driving the system. And this was revealed in a speech by Abdullah Ahmad in Singapore in the 1980s. However, my argument is that the Malay political establishment lost control of that vision sometime in the 1990s when another group came in and offered another vision of the state. This new vision of the state is an extension of Ketuanan Melayu, and it became known as what I called Ketuanan Melayu Islam. So what we're seeing now in Malaysia is a battle of what vision Malaysia is. The sad thing, of course, is that the non-Malay Malaysians are totally shut out of this discussion. Coming back to Munira's book, the big missing part in the present volume, and I hope she'll write about it in the second volume, is the rise of political Islam on Malaysian campuses, both among the staff and the students. My take is that it will fundamentally change the public university system in Malaysia as we know it today. Reading the book, I only have one question to Munira, and that is, why was chapter 9 included? I really cannot see the connection between chapter 9, especially the Japanese part, and the rest of the book. Or maybe it is that I'm not reading it properly. To summarize, Munira's book is a welcome addition to the many books on contemporary life in Malaysia. And for Malaysian watchers such as myself, it confirms many of our observations arising over the years. The sad thing, and I hope I'm reading Munira correctly, is that things will get a lot worse before it gets better. And I have to say, I agree with this assessment. But I live in hope that I'm wrong and things will turn around when intellectuals and the political class realize that things are heading down the wrong path. So congratulations, Munira, and I hope there'll be a Bahasa Melayu version coming out soon. Thank you.
Thank you, James. But Maura?
Yeah, Meredith, do you want to jump in and offer your
Sure.
comments now? Yeah, okay.
Sure. So I'll start by saying that many times in the past, I've read one of Munira's columns and been really relieved to hear someone articulating really clearly a problem. For me, those are usually the ones related to higher education in Malaysia, that anyone who follows Malaysian politics and policy knows to be huge and pressing, but that so many seem really dead set on simply ignoring or just assuming to be irremediable fate. So this book gathers together over 24 of these sorts of gems. So the result then is less a clearly structured, explicitly articulated agenda than more of a pointillist image almost of a society, and especially a higher education system that seems to be floundering intellectually, ethically, and socio-politically. As you might guess from that statement, this collection of essays does not make for an uplifting book, as James also suggested. There's a clear claim that with concerted effort, Malaysia can pull itself out of a bog toward a more critical-minded, ethical, tolerant, and inclusive future. But overall, and this may be, in my case, a misreading, but it seemed more pessimistic than otherwise about the odds of that happening. Yet this is not a book of the author's whining. It's a set of focused, trenchant critiques, which many of us have been enjoying reading all along and now can read in a comprehensive collection. So the core themes here, as even if you haven't read the book, you should probably be picking them up by now, of a feudal mindset, broadly speaking, for which Munira draws on a term her father, Syed Hussein Alatas, had popularized, or Bebalism, and all that, Bebalisma, excuse me, and all that entails for politics, And relatedly, an education system, especially higher education, they're not exclusively that. That's in need of serious reform to cultivate and support critical thinking, higher standards, and intellectualism. Perhaps the most apt statement of a key takeaway comes on page 85, which is Malaysian society often goes through periods when politicians are convincing in their hopeful plans, only to be disappointing in their lack of political will and concrete follow-up. And I say that because this book really takes us from, essentially the changeover of power in GE14, the 14th general election in 2018, to the present day. So this was a period in which there were a lot of hopeful plans. There are fewer being articulated now, but still some. Overall, I found, just as a sort of general statement, the book to be genuinely accessible and readable, but informed by deep knowledge and intellectual inquiry. So this is very much a model of the public intellectual writing based on academic knowledge, based on research, based on critical inquiry, but writing for a broader public to be informed by these findings. So this is, as James also noted, a book that's written for Malaysians and friends. There's not a lot of hand-holding on the details. So even I, somebody who follows Malaysia fairly closely, had to think to remember some of the incidents mentioned that are less of the moment now than at the time that the essay might first have been penned. But the sense comes through regardless, even if some of the details might be less familiar to some readers. And the tone is consistently critical, at times bordering on cynical, but it's consistently also constructive, which I appreciated. Munira presents very strong opinions, for instance, on the suitability of English or of the Socratic method, specifically in education, that might lead her or reader to overlook some more legitimate counter-arguments. But then again, some of the counter-arguments one hears are very readily dismissible, so I don't see that as necessarily a fault. And one of the things that I most enjoyed in especially the introductory framing of the volume was the extent to which we get a sense of this as partly a personal story, or at least the genesis of this is a personal story, as a backdrop to a Malaysian story. So Munira honors in the text the achievements of both her parents, Sarojini Sahara and Saitu Sinalitas, but the ideas developed here, of course, draw far more from her father's works and writings. So that said, to some extent, the volume serves to confirm Saitu Sinalitas's prescience. Corruption has been the bane of Malaysian politics, without question, including the externalities of efforts to eradicate it and what that means for politics more broadly, as well as his own clear conviction as someone very deeply engaged, not just in academia as a professor, but also as an administrator, but his own clear conviction regarding the importance of higher ed. The main themes I saw were Malaysia's disappearing group of influential thinkers, governance and politics, leadership in higher education, cronyism, patronage, and so forth. Munira lays these out in very different ways throughout the volume, but they all come together quite coherently as a somewhat pointillist whole. She is unflinchingly critical of undue deference, of unproductive forms of identity politics, of shallow politicking, and of uncritical thinking generally, whether in political institutions or in those of higher education, and wants to see Malaysians cultivate a new mindset and actively to pursue reforms, both internalized reforms of mindset, of ethics, and so forth, and of institutional structures. Munira states that her outlook for the near future is, and I quote, neither bleak nor cheerful, but cautiously optimistic, that Malaysian mindsets will change over the next few generations, which is a somewhat long-term view. And I think it's probably a reasonable expectation, as James also suggested. I did want at some point, this might be in the next volume, along with Rukun Negara and all these various other things, it'll be a long volume. What is likely achievable and in what sequence? Or more succinctly, what is to be done and by whom, within government or otherwise, and how plausible is that? In other words, if cautiously optimistic, by what mechanisms? So directly or indirectly in these essays, we see a quest to find the root causes of the pathologies identified. For instance, in subpar universities that fail to cultivate mindsets or offer incentives to excel, which limit the availability of the sort of public intellectuals Munira's father famously examined. Partly because I share the critique. I enjoyed actually reading, and I got the sense that James also did from bit of conversation earlier, that she has it in for those with aristocratic titles, the datos and tantris and so forth. Not that the titles themselves are the problem, but the entitlement that so many of their holders display and the treatment they experience, plus what she calls a sometimes dehumanizing hierarchy that too slavish use of these titles perpetuates. And part of why I appreciated the chance to read this is that these are such taken for granted institutions and sources of entitlement in Malaysia, and ways of codifying and perpetuating an often really damaging hierarchy that's so uncritically taken in so many ways and at so many times. That said, as James also noted, the Bangsar bubble perspective, the perspective, not that Munira hasn't been outside that bubble, but one does get the perspective of urban, educated, financially comfortable, and someone who is in that position and who has the confidence and undoubtedly also the privilege to tilt at some sacred cows. So I might push back a bit at some claims, for instance, that mindset instead of strategic calculation is what drives people to accept patronage politics. There are some claims here that are hard to read, though I would say that they're wrong. They're just hard to read. Things like a statement that, and I quote, rural folk revere their leaders, especially those with titles. Most rural Malaysians have blind loyalty for their titled heroes. Now, I, again, wouldn't say it's wrong, but at the same time, it suggests intrinsically less critical capacity, even if the premise of entrenched acceptance for the feudal order is fair. So there's also a presumed teleology here in terms such as using mature to describe a polity, and saying that the yen for name calling, the demands for apologies, etc., in Malaysia is essentially adolescent political behavior from which Malaysians must, she uses the term, graduate. But there is the obvious fact that even supposedly hoary, well-established democracies may incline towards some very similar behaviors. So it's not that it is uncommon to suggest an idea of teleology, and there is that expectation of growing out of some of these mindsets and so forth. But we do see democratic backsliding and really an ethical and ideological backsliding, one might say, across the supposedly super mature West as well, with my own United States being, Exhibit A. That said, I personally found the critique of academic standards, valuing quantity over quality of publications, the Professor Kangkong phenomenon, the lack of academic integrity, the lack of thought in developing curricula about what ends policymakers want or expect students' education to serve. All of that is just especially trenchant and especially key to overcoming Bevelisma, that mindset that feudalism cultivates. Some of the criticism here may reflect unrealistic expectations. For example, again, another quote here, a year after Pakatan Harapan's victory, we had yet to resolve race and religion-based tensions in society. I'm not sure a year would have been enough in the best of circumstances, but indeed, that is too much to hope, and nor is it wholly reducible to government actions at the best of times. Indeed, throughout, there's some amount of conflation of what government can do and what requires a society-wide, likely generation-spanning approach. However, Munira is right to highlight, of course, the need for, or at least a high value of, government impetus and push to change. So overall, I found the volume really well worth reading, really engaging, very accessible again. And Munira, you are absolutely to be congratulated on a forthright, incisive examination of not just what's wrong, but what might also make things closer to right in Malaysia.
Thank you, Meredith.
Good morning and good evening to everyone on board. And thank you so much for having me here. I mean, it's such an honor and privilege to be able to discuss this book. Thank you, Munira, for inviting me. Thank you, Maura. Firstly, I want to just start by saying that I'm really pleased to hear that you're really thinking of working on the commentary of the Rukun Negara commentary much more, because I think really you will put your work in conversation with scholars, activists in other contexts, including the South Asian context, as Indian scholars, activists, who are really going back to the Constitution, commentaries on the Constitution in present-day situations. Now, I think this book, I mean, there's so much in this book, and I hope I'll try not to repeat what James and Meredith said, but one of the things that really struck me about this book was the way in which, you really introduced us to the world of post-colonial patronage networks, the sense of entitlement. I mean, one of the things that was in almost every chapter of the book was, who gets to speak or who is entitled to speak for sectors of Malaysian society. Now, be it certain men speaking about female bodies or children, or be it figures speaking about, entitled to speak about religious communities. I think you're really putting that out for us. I mean, beyond that, in all this bleak picture, we heard about the insecurities, anxieties of multi-religious, multi-ethnic society, and how, for that matter, these were really being played by these patronage networks. What was happening in this political system? Now, one of the things that was central, as Meredith pointed out, was this idea that amidst this cronyism, amidst this patronage networks, there was something that this structure, this elite structure, and beyond that, with the help of the media and all that, was encouraging was a society based on uncritical thinking. Now, one of the things that of course it was extremely bleak, but I think one of the things that I almost, as I went to the conclusion of the book, I found some notes of cautious optimism. And I left with some of that cautious optimism based on the fact that every chapter of your book had reminded us of how much patronage, feudalism, corruption had gotten to such an intense scale that it had plagued the whole system, where, for that matter, I mean, we couldn't expect reforms to be on such a spectacular scale. The reforms were going to be slow, and that it was so much of a system to lead through. And that's the kind of cautious optimism that you left us with, I think, at the end of the book. And I think even in your conversation earlier. Now, one of the things that I mean, that as I was reading the book, you constantly remind us also, Munira, is that the conversation regarding feudalism and feudal mentality, the feudal mentality is not a new one. I mean, yes, as you remind us, your father's wonderful work, Professor Hussain Alatas's work on psychological feudalism, was really striking at the fact that in a post-colonial context, both patronage networks were not just simply re-entrenched, but continued in any post-NEP context. I mean, one of the things that also struck me was how you started your book by really reminding us about some of his earliest publications, his Progressive Islam journal in the 1950s. And I kept thinking about this as I read your book, as was how, for the matter, Professor Hussain Alatas's work, really from the Progressive Islam journal, was reminding us about how, perhaps understanding the problems of societies was a sociological problem in terms of understanding individual neurosis, in this understanding how populations who had been through colonial and post-colonial eras of submission, for that matter, how, for that matter, kind of psychological feudalism would stay and would be something that intellectuals and activists would struggle in post-colonial society. Now, his work in terms of be it essays on feudalism in Malaysian society, or even as we go on to the late 70s, your father's work on like Kita dengan Islam, one of the things that was very striking here was really using these universal models like feudalism, but really understanding it in a particularity of a Malaysian context. Now, another thing that was very striking, and this is really related to, I think, many parts of your book, was how your father's work was really reminding us of the discussion of progress, liberalism, without the disavowal of heritage. I mean, that was quite striking, and it's striking because of the fact, as you remind us, both in your book and book chapters and the discussion earlier, is how the discussion of liberalism in Malaysia today has almost been overtaken by the elite. I mean, it's kind of the association of the term liberalism with all kinds of permissivity or kind of godlessness and a threat to heritage is something that really your Professor Hussain Alatas's works from the 50s to the 70s and even were really reminding us itself that there can be a sophisticated conversation on progressive liberal Islam. And I mean, as you reminded us earlier, I mean, events are being cancelled. I mean, conversations are being banned on the basis of promoting a form of liberal Islam. Now, this, as you said, and I mean, now, as I close my comments, I wanted to move us to this, that one of the things that your second half of the book, and James has spoken, Meredith has spoken about this, is how, for that matter, this idea of illiberalism, I mean, if I could borrow your terms, is really seeping into the to facets of academy. Now, this is the world that we are looking to for the will to think, this open discourse. Now, it's on one hand, it's this draconian measures, as you point out, but on the other hand, there's this will to avoid a kind of knowledge production. There's this will to really be stuck with a kind of, be it a feudal mentality or a aversion to thinking. Now, as you say, now this in a university context, I mean, this takes the form of political appointees who are encouraging such a impediment to will of thinking. And one of the things that I really was hoping to hear more about, and hopefully if I could hear more in the next book, is really about what was the vision of your father, for that matter, as a university vice chancellor vis-a-vis the vice chancellors of today, for that matter. What is happening at that scale of university thinking? Now, in concluding my remarks, I just wanted to also put something out that I think the book and your work really reminds us of the importance of really thinking of the feudal mentality, thinking of patronage networks, etc. Now, one of the questions I possibly had in reading the book was, what other academic conversations are having, what other progressive liberal academic conversations are happening in the Malaysian academic scene? Now, conversations concerning some of these issues, very sympathetic to the position you're making, or you're taking here. But on the other hand, departing from a notion of a feudal mentality, perhaps, or perhaps even thinking in terms of perhaps really moving away from this and thinking of different intellectual trajectories. Now, Meredith pointed out that could there be sectors of the Malaysian academic scene who are really reacting to thinking of these choices that we are referring to as feudal mentality here as being strategic choices. Now, could there be a conversation on modernization? Could there be a conversation on elite choices here that's happening in the academic scene that's sympathetic to your position, but very different? Now, of course, this is a very facile point compared to the book and the amount of detail and how much you educate us with every chapter of the book. And I can't thank you enough for writing it. Congratulations, and I hope everyone who hasn't had a chance to read it reads it too.
Thank you, Teren.
Thank you.
All right, thanks to all of you for your comments. I think at this point, Munira, if you have any responses to the different points that were brought up by our speakers. I also remind our audience members that we are taking questions through the Q&A box. So if you have any of those, we have about 15 minutes left in the scheduled program. So please submit your questions or comments for our speakers. And as I said, Munira, why don't you begin?
Thank you, Maura, and thank you, James, Meredith, and Teren, for all your comments, your input, your questions, your critiques as well. Okay, maybe I'll just very briefly go straight to the points. For instance, James, you have a question about chapter 9, which, and I smiled when you brought that up, because actually I was anticipating a question, why is that chapter there? Maybe I need to, in a next edition, make it clearer. The issue of the Rome Statute that came up, where and the ICERD rally and all that during the time of the first Pakatan Harapan, I think it was end of 2018 or 2019. You know, the public was very horrified that the government had backtracked, and there was a lot of criticism in the media about this, and a response to those criticisms came from an academic. And the reason why I decided to write a response to her response was because I was always anticipating, I'm waiting for a professor to write and support the government's move and support the fact that we don't need the Rome Statute and all that. So I was critical of her retort. Perhaps it didn't come out as strongly as I hoped. And maybe I will not take out, remove the chapter, but I would definitely modify it because, and I'm glad, thank you, James, for bringing that up. Meredith, let me move on to you. Your suggestion, or rather your question, if I caught it correctly, was what is likely to be achievable in the next few generations for reform? You correctly understood the entire theme of the book as being rather pessimistic and cynical. But as Teren said, I am cautiously optimistic. I just wouldn't say that I don't want to think of reform as every election cycle. And I've moved away from that. And maybe in the beginning at 2018, we were all caught up with the euphoria. But I quickly learned that it's just not going to happen. Because remember, 2018 was quite a paradigm shift. Even though we were prepared from 2008 onwards, we were prepared for this ultimate overthrowing of the establishment. But now I've recharged my batteries, and I'm realizing that the likely achievable let me put it this way. The only way we can actually experience true reform is to unpack, deconstruct the mess that the education system is in. Because unless we link preschool education, primary, secondary school education, including the universities, with the problems that are happening, we're not going to make a substantial amount of transformation. And I criticize the way we are talking about education reform because we're leaving out, when we speak about universities, problems of the university, we leave out the secondary schools, we leave out teacher training, we leave out preschool training. So it's still done in isolation. And to me, that is problematic. And that's why I have a cynical view about the future. But the hope is that the current administration will look at the council that was set up, the National Higher Education Council. It was set up some years ago, but disbanded in 2020, or during just after the Pakatan Harapan fell. And I recently was giving a discussion on radio, BFM 89.9, and I drew a parallel between the National Consultative Council of 1970 and the Higher Education Council today, meaning setting up a council and discussing, unpacking serious problems to fix Malaysia is what we need. We did that after May 13, 1969. But another argument is nothing really has been fixed. But that's, again, subject for a third book. My point is there has to be political will to get many stakeholders together and talk about what next. And I don't see that happening. Right now, I don't see that happening under the current government because education is still rhetorical. Education reform is still rhetorical. So I don't know if I've answered Meredith's question, but at least that's, and I take your point about some of the terms I use in terms of, for example, mature. I guess what I meant is intellectually simplistic rather than adolescent. So, the use of terms, yes, I admit maybe I need to focus on perceptions, other people's perception, given that I'm trying to reach a general public. And lastly, Teren, thank you for your comments. And you raised a lot of important issues that I have not, that I could expand upon later. And the question or the topic of illiberalism seeping into academia. Well, you know, I was thinking it's not just a Malaysian phenomenon. And especially now with what's happening in Gaza, you can see a lot of that happening. But of course, it was very obvious with the election of Trump and what was happening in Europe at the time as well. So there is illiberalism seeping into academia globally. And part of the problem is we've lost sight of, as what James said, what is the true meaning of to be educated? Because right now it is the business of education that has taken over. So, you know, there are a lot of ideas here to unpack, and I really appreciate the input of all three of you. Thank you so much. I think that's all I have to respond to, Maura. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So at this point, if there are any audience members who would like to submit questions, or if anyone on the panel has a follow-up question, comment, suggestion, looks like we just got one. So Munira, someone has asked, what do you think would be the impact of Malaysia's political health on the rest of the region?
Okay, that's the rest of the region. Well, it depends what kind of political health is being conceived. If Malaysia's green wave takes over and we become an Islamic state, hypothetical, I'm sure there will be considerable impact. But if Anwar Ibrahim's government and further reforms take place and our economy improves over time within the next 4 years, that too will have a positive, it will have a positive, no two there, it will have a positive effect on the region. So I'm not sure what this question really applies to, but definitely whatever happens in Malaysia could have an impact. We are a small country, but we are part of ASEAN. So it could definitely have an impact. But I'm concerned mainly, and I think James is too, about this so-called green wave. And I'm also concerned about, I was from the very beginning concerned about Undi 18. I was not very happy with it because, again, going back to the use of my term mature, voters at the age of 18 are not politically exposed in the school system. They are also not politically encouraged, or they're not educationally encouraged to debate politics at the school level. So allowing this cohort or permitting them might be a good thing in different countries, but we're not at that stage of development where we can be happy about a new cohort. And I think this is part of the reason why we have experienced what we have in terms of the green wave. I don't know if I've answered that question very well, but it'll have to do for now.
Yes, this is always the tough part of the session, is when you get questions out of the blue and have to think up answers on your feet. So as I said, audience members, please feel free to submit questions. We have a couple of minutes left, or if any panelists have additional comments, suggestions, hopes for a third volume that Munira suggested. So what are your conclusions regarding the quality of education and the need for integrity that you highlight in your study? I know that's a big part of section 2 of the book. And would you kindly share briefly again your thoughts relating to corruption?
Okay, they're big questions.
Yes.
What are my conclusions about the quality of education? Well, I think I keep speaking about this and writing about this even after finishing the book. My conclusions right now are that we continue to fail. The government continues to fail us because there hasn't been enough concrete strategies to head in that direction. As I mentioned, we need to seriously talk about teacher education, for instance. We speak about the decline in the PISA results, but we are delinking it from the decline in teacher quality. So how do we make of, how can we conclude then? Are we, just because we are aware that our PISA score has declined, means that we are consciously making steps to improve our system? No, because as I said, the link is not made to tackling the problem of our teachers. And it may not just be their education, not just be teacher education. It's a combination of salaries. It's a combination of, as well, infrastructure of the schools. So it is a huge question. The quality of education, if you ask me right now, January 25th, 2024, I would say I'm still worried. I don't see anything positive. I don't see the majority of talk about reforming education running ahead. We are still in a rut. And what is the second part of the question about corruption?
Corruption, yes.
Well, I would say I am optimistic, even though I do know I can explain why, or rather I can understand the situation the current unity government is in. I don't want to get into too much detail about that, but what I would say is this: in my conclusion of my presentation, I made the point that of settling old scores. I mean, the call to track down the very rich and ask them to declare their assets, and part of the use of the MACC to track down these corrupt people is part of the settling old scores as well. So I wouldn't say that is not something that should happen, but I'm wondering, once these old scores are settled, is it going to be a systematic strategy to fix Malaysia? And I'm optimistic, but very cautious that it will happen. So that's the safest and the most genuine answer I can give to that. Thanks for the question, though.
Okay, and we have two questions left. There's one that I think will be fairly brief, and it's actually a question that I had as well. So the audience member writes, "Thanks for a great session." Their question is, since foreign universities' satellite campuses in Malaysia are not subject to exactly the same performance targets, are they, or could they be, more hospitable to critical scholarship? So I believe the University of Nottingham has a campus in Malaysia, and I'm not sure what other schools are there. But how do they differ from the rest of the education system?
Well, I tend to think that anything out of the public university system would definitely encourage more debate, on-campus debates. I have been invited several times to foreign branch university campuses here, and I was very pleasantly surprised to have conversations with the students. And I judge a university's quality by the students. And I'm not talking about foreign students, I'm talking about Malaysian students. So I was very pleasantly surprised with the courage to ask probing questions. Having said that, my last year of being of my career in a public university, I was asked to be a panel presenter at a political science department in a public university, I was very pleasantly surprised with the probing questions that came from that group. So I would say young people are changing. I have hope in the young, which some may say I'm now contradicting my Undi 18 comments, but nevertheless, this is not a movement. I would say this is not a movement yet. And I would also say the foreign universities do have a lot more space to be a lot more critical. And of course, that ties into, they are not subject to some of the same acts and legislation that public universities are. So, which probably explains why there is more room to be more open in debates. And of course, as you know, University of Nottingham did step in to host the Professor Kuru, who was not allowed to speak elsewhere. So there is that. I would say the problem I speak about in the book, or I write about in the book, are predominantly concerned with the public university system.
Great. And I'm going to end with a question that has been posed to all four of our panelists, and we're going to do a lightning round. You each get about 30 seconds to give me your thoughts on this. And so Frank Young asks, or comments, I personally don't see Sarawak and Sabah able to bring about political reformation or transformation in the peninsula or the whole country. So can we get your thoughts on that comment? Meredith, why don't we start with you, because I'm looking at you on the screen.
Okay. So I'm a little confused by the question, just because Sabah and Sarawak would not intuitively be the starting point for reform across the peninsula, since they're not on the peninsula. I think one of the things that, and I'll be very quick and just make one point, one of the things that might be a source for some push towards reform coming from, especially Sarawak at this point, is simply the pushback against totalizing norms, so against, this must be the way that we approach religion, or that we approach language, or that we approach questions of identity broadly, and that it has to be the same across all of Malaysia, even though there are very real differences, most notable perhaps in Sarawak, but also discernible across communities elsewhere in Malaysia as well. So this idea of trying to resist, whether one calls it a green wave or one calls it merely ethno-nationalism, with alternative discourses, alternative visions, that is actually coming much more from East Malaysia than from the peninsula right now.
Great. Teren, do you have any comments?
I'm sorry, I have nothing to add.
Okay.
I totally agree with what Meredith just said, so thank you.
Great. James?
Right, so I'm going to give a very non-academic answer, primarily because I'm from Sarawak, or I tend to represent the views of East Malaysia. I think the bottom line is that the people of Sarawak and also Sabah think that it's too late to reform anything on the Malayan side. So basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to do their own thing. And what they're hoping for is that the Malayan side doesn't turn nasty again like the first 50 years of the Federation. So they're trying to create, how shall I put it, a bubble, autonomy bubble, and they try to do it as soon as possible. And the real fundamental thing that's coming up is whether they will get 1/3 of the seats in parliament. If they can get that, then I think the autonomy project will be successful. If they don't get that, I think we will have problems in terms of federal-state relationship. I think in terms of the other angle that I think which is missing from a lot of discussion is that Sabah and Sarawak is actually they are the spear of the head in terms of trying to rejig the entire federal-state relationship as we understand it in the Malaysian system. So they're trying to sort of start the ball game in terms of decentralization, trying to make federal-state relationship more equal in terms of the state, because for the first 50 years, when you talk about federalism in Malaysia, right, there's actually no federalism at all. It's really dominance by the center. So I think those are the two important points I want to make. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Munira, we'll finish with you.
Okay, I don't have much to say, although I would say this. I think the only way for Sabah and Sarawak to feature within this combined effort for reform is going to have to come from Peninsula's understanding or acceptance that Sabah and Sarawak is part of Malaysia. And my problem with this, and I do admit I have not discussed it in the book, but there are practical reasons for not doing so. But my point is, there's not enough attention being given on the peninsula to the fact that Sabah and Sarawak are very important entities of the country, and yet we are ignoring it. And we are in schools, even the columnists, for instance, they're very Peninsula Malaya-centric. And so my point is, I'm not going to extend my comments about this, except for the fact that if there is going to be any involvement or contribution of reform from Sabah and Sarawak, it is because Peninsula is recognizing finally that there would not be a Malaysia without Sabah and Sarawak. That's my point. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thanks to all four of you for participating today and for your comments on Munira's book. Anyone in the audience who's interested in purchasing a copy of the book can go to asianstudies.org and click on our bookstore tab, and you'll see Munira's new book as well as all of the other volumes from our AAS Publications department. So with that, I'm going to call today's program to a close. Thank you again for your participation, for your great questions, and for your time. Have a good day.
Thank you.